Today's message is how, by committing ourselves to increase both our spiritual depth, we can be more responsible to our own well-being, the well-being of those around us, and for justice and care for the earth. This sermon is inspired by the work of humanist Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Dr. Kendall Gibbons. For those of you who are wondering if this message is going to be about God and the divine with the large D, well, a little bit. But I'm hoping you were pleasantly surprised this morning to find out how many definitions can be used by humanists as well, and everyone in between, as well as any other traditions and schools of thought. So to just address this issue up front, I thought that I would share with you the definition of spirituality from the Cambridge Dictionary of Christianity, no less. So please listen carefully for the humanist part. In contemporary usage, spirituality commonly refers to the human experience in daily life of that which is perceived to have ultimate meaning or value. The stress on immediacy of the experience is sometimes used to distinguish spirituality from religion. Religion with its more formalized doctrinal and institutional structures. But most people acknowledge that spirituality can be found both within and outside the boundaries of religious traditions. Spirituality is human engagement with reality at its most fundamental level. Whether that reality is identified as the divinity of the cosmos or the deepest dimension of the self. Spirituality connects belief with practice, feeling with commitment, and the person with the political. Thus, spirituality may be understood as the human experience of and response to all that is perceived to be good, to be beautiful, and to be true. I hope everyone found at least one line in there that you can put in your heart. As I mentioned earlier, today's message was inspired by the work of Reverend Kendall Gibbons. She starts with science by reminding us that humans are developmental creatures. We don't start in childhood with all that we need for adult life. Rather, our greatest abilities, emotionally, physically, and morally, are something we grow into. It's greatly influenced by those around us and the experiences around us. I know from 25 years of being a social worker that life places many things in our path that can stunt or enhance the developmental growth. We begin our lives in families who nurture and celebrate us, hopefully, but sometimes they damage self-esteem and our sense of what we deserve and our inherent worth. After we leave our families of origin and go out into the world, we continue to have life experiences with others, and we live in relationship to communities, families, co-workers, neighbors, people in our faith communities, both past and present. We continue to add on to our stories. Both faith leaders and social scientists have the same assertion that self-discovery and maturity help us find original wholeness. So part of our spiritual growth is to return to wholeness, which is to experience tenderness and compassion, joy and peace. Kendall says, This is the human experience of longing, the realization of the open secret that there is no goal, no test to take, no one keeping score. That which is not broken is always present within us, whether or not we name it, whether or not we are paying attention. And the final recognition is that you are the unshakable truth that you have been here all along, waiting for that exiled self to return. That is what the mystics of every tradition have been saying for centuries, in whatever language that they could summon to their purpose. It's not a function of any scripture or school, but of the human condition of maturing spiritual awareness. What a secret! That the core fundamental compassion and peace, the wholeness, was always in us. It's just that these other things got in the way. It's developing our spirituality that allows us to find it. In our own denominational history, Universalists were telling us, don't have your eyes cast up at the heaven. Rather, your spiritual work is in the everyday, and your spiritual work is in your relationality with others. Gibbons and other mystics also tell us spiritual maturity is what allows people of different beliefs to coexist in meaningful ways. For humanists and theists, skeptics and mystics, prophets and seekers, everything that we find here this morning is what allows us to coexist with respect, grace, and upholding one another. It's also the bedrock for our social and environmental justice work. So what are those steps to becoming generous, humble, merciful, and accepting of ourselves and others? Such a small task, right? That we work on forever. How do we become wise? So I will tell you, spiritual practices are probably the best place to start. And in your order of service this morning is the tree of contemplative practices, which I'm actually not going to really talk about directly, but I want you to know, take it home with you and see what resonates for you throughout the week and the month. So I've attempted to consolidate all the advice about spiritual maturity into 5 points, and I will fail terribly. You'll probably just grasp one because there's just too much to take in. So first is the self-awareness, which is intention. To know what you want and have your behavior follow that goal. Our behavior follows after we set an intention. I recently, when I was unpacking, came across again a book by Stephen Covey, The Businessman, and I think he's a prophetic speaker as well as being an ethicist. And in it, the page that was marked says, anything less than a conscious commitment to the important is an unconscious commitment to the unimportant. So if you just bumble through your life and let the forces around you set the agenda for you, you will be in trouble in no time at all. Think about what dominates our society. Capitalism without good ethics. Gibbons said it also means to figure out, where do you start and end as a person? And where does the other person start? And to be aware of that boundary, because that boundary is sacred. And also what it means is you have to pay attention to the impact of your actions. the difference between what you intended, which might be incredibly good, and the impact was where something lands with a person which is not what you intended. So instead of mindlessly moving from one life experience to the next, set intentions for your day. The second piece of wisdom that I've summarized is an orientation toward reverence, wonder, and gratitude. The person who has the orientation of reverence dwells and reflects upon the fundamental surprise that anything at all exists, that we are even here, that there's something out in the universe at all rather than nothing. This forces us to not take things for granted. Gibbons says, when we take out our existence and consciousness as an object of reflection, when we are able to stop being embedded in our experience and actually think about it, which is so much harder to do than to say, but stop being embedded and actually thinking about it, the very fact that existence is at all becomes wonder and surprise. And we can be grateful for every day that we wake up and face a new sunrise. And it's out of that consciousness that everything arises. Everything becomes oriented toward wonder, which is the opposite of just taking our lives for granted. And out of gratitude, reverence comes. The desire to praise the doe that walks out of the woods to munch on your flower garden. To stop and observe the complex patterns of a new bud or a leaf, or even the magic going on now as things are forming seeds for the next generation. Or the children running and laughing, or carrying onions and potatoes and rice up to the front. I'm wondering if they're making soup back there right now. Just like they got what they need. We can only hope. The third element is a practice of the practice of spiritual maturity is the thing which occurs when we don't get what we want or what we need. There will be suffering. So the third element is a path of surrender. So we hear the Buddhism in that assertion. There are laws of nature and science that not everything will be possible. The advice from Reverend Gibbons is to develop a discipline of engaging the world as we find it, rather than be distracted by the wishful thinking about what we would rather have. Instead, how can we work with what's in front of us? Gibbons uses the example of 12-step addiction programs, again, with or without God, that the first step is to acknowledge our powerlessness in that moment, and then move from that place to assume a new vision. Not stopping at what we don't want, but creating what we do want. And I think related to this is the ability to be present with pain without panic, and to allow ourselves to feel compassion in the moment. We want to rush in and we want to fix, and sometimes we can't fix it. So part of that growing spiritual maturity is to just accept that pain is part of the world. And when we encounter it, to transform it through our own consciousness. Perhaps we can only be there for that person, and being there is enough. Our ability to do this in community is tremendously helpful for those who are grieving. Attempting to rush through grief is not helpful. Spiritual maturity asks us to offer validation of the pain of a grieving person. And that will be experienced by them as encouragement. So they don't need the statement, things will get better soon. They need the statement, I see that you're still in pain. Let me sit with you for a while. And our justice work, I think, calls us to do the same. Our role is not always to run in there as saviors, rather to stand in witness and solidarity, to allow those who are hurting to lead and define what they need. And we just talked about this when Susan was giving that information about the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. They are committed to going in, when they go have money and they go into communities, they find the leaders who are already there and say, what does your community need? And how can we help you do that? Rather than rushing in with their idea of what the community needs, which is not always helpful. And it's disempowering. So the fourth concept I will call vulnerability. Gibbons says, spiritually mature people grasp the principle that our capacity to contain joy is also the extent of sorrow we are able to feel, and vice versa. That to love anything or anyone is to expose ourselves sooner or later to the risk of loss. Yet knowing this, the person who seeks to grow spiritually embraces love with its attendant risks and sometimes even cherishing grief if they can see it as a measure of the love they have given. Your grieving for those you love, your grief honors the depth of that relationship, and it is a normal part of the human experience. Lastly is the examination of mercy and justice. A person progressing in spiritual maturity will not only look toward wholeness, where beauty, justice, and mercy and forgiveness intersect. We cannot grow and change without examining our mistakes. And I will add here that shame is never helpful. What is helpful in our process of spiritual maturity is just to acknowledge our humanness. We all say things that we regret later. We make mistakes throughout our lives, both large and small. I've already made several since I've been here in the congregation. But that's okay, and we'll get through. When we resist the urge to hide by distracting ourselves, obfuscating, blaming others, and denying, we can't grow. We can't change. We run away so that we get a little temporary relief, but it really isn't relief, and it doesn't help us to grow. The questions are, how can I do this differently next time? What was going on with me that I was left in that critical place? And do reparations need to be made? So I'm going to conclude this morning's message with an ask. Rather, what will you ask of yourself this coming week on your road to spiritual maturity? Remember, it requires thought, setting aside time to think or journal or talk with someone about the qualities you want to nurture. See if the tree of contemplative practice is helpful to you. Think about how our fellowship community can help all of us in this process by being a mirror to reflect our work. Hey, in a cheering section, when we come across our human failings, the cheering section that says, hey, yeah, we've all done that, but what's next? Becoming self-aware, compassionate, humble, peaceful, and interdependent is a journey, not a destination. And it's going to look different for every person. We cannot start until we define the vision we want for ourselves. Our faith community can nurture our individual and collective capacity on our way to spiritual maturity. May it be so.